Hey guys, this is Milo back with another video, and today I'm going to show you how to make an axe sheath. This is part 2, and the first thing that we're going to be doing in this part is gluing the welt into the sheath. The welt is a piece of leather that goes in between the layers, and that protects the stitches from getting cut by the axe blade. Like if you were to drop your axe, it would have to cut all the way through that piece of leather before it gets to the stitches, so it really does act as a great layer of protection. And I'm using a normal leather glue from Amazon to glue it. I know a lot of people use contact cement, and I'm sure that both work totally fine. But one thing that I recommend doing when you fold over the top of the sheath to glue it is to wet the top of the sheath, and that makes it easier to fold so that you aren't fighting against the force of the leather trying to pull it back apart. And I do a lot of different things to try and get the glue to set. Recently I was using Bridal Veg Tan, which is a wax and oil finish leather, and that is made to be waterproof, so of course it doesn't want to glue. And what I usually do is I either hammer it, I clip it, I might put weight on it. I literally do everything I possibly can do to get that leather to set. And for normal veg tan leather, it won't be that difficult. All you have to do is clamp it a little bit, or just put some weight on it. And once the glue has set on one side, I'm going to trim the bottom of it so that it lines up well with the flap, and then I'm going to glue the other side and then press them together. Make sure that the back of the sheath is lined up as perfectly as possible, and then I'm going to make sure that the welt is lined up nicely. And if it doesn't line up as nicely as you hoped, there's no big deal because you can always trim and sand afterwards. But I always try and make it as perfect as possible the first time so I don't have to spend extra time fixing it the other time around. And now I'm going to be punching the holes for my snaps. Basically, I'm going to figure out a good place on the flap to mark the hole. And I kind of want it to be centered. This is an asymmetrical flap, so it doesn't matter too much, but I'd try and make it as nice as I can. And you definitely don't want the snap like hanging over the edge or anything like that. And the hole that you punch, you want it to be roughly the same size as the snap stem. You don't want it to spin around and have too much wiggle room, because then it can kind of work its way loose eventually and then spin around, and that's not so nice. Now I'm trimming the front of the sheath, and of course I tried to make it as nice as possible, but when you're lining up 3 layers of leather, there's going to be a decent margin of error, so when you're doing this you want to make sure to have a very sharp blade, so that's why I dropped it a little bit before. And another thing that I'm doing is I'm trying to just follow the high spots and not go into the low spots, because once you start digging into the lower parts of the welt, that's when you start to get like hills and it just gets all bumpy. And of course you can sand that out, but it's just kind of hard to do that. So you want to make it as gradual as possible. And now I'm sanding the front of the sheath. I'm just slowly going back and forth with my sanding drum, and this is on my drill press. I really like doing it this way. If you just do it by hand after skiving and trimming with your knife, it's gonna be a little bit difficult, I gotta admit. And after I do the sanding drum, I will do it by hand a little bit with a higher grit sandpaper to make it as nice as possible. But this isn't necessary, it's only if you want a really beautiful edge. So it just kind of depends on the look you're going for. And now I'm beveling my edges. This is really important because when you burnish it, it kind of mushes the edges down, and it'll get this weird mushrooming effect if you don't bevel it. Also, I've noticed if the edge isn't perfectly straight, if I do get a low spot from trimming it wrong, then this will kind of make it look nicer and more subtle. Also, if you want to buy these tools but you don't know where to look, then I do have an Amazon shopping list in the description below. I do make some commission off of that, but it really helps me out. And now we're going to groove the stitching line. This helps you create the perfect distance of the stitching from the edge of the leather, and it also sets the stitches deeper into the leather, which actually protects it because it's not sitting on top of the leather. Now I only do this on one side because with sanding the edge, it's possible that I might go a little bit off square, and if it's not 90 degrees, then your groove line won't be the same on the other side. It'll be slightly offset. So when I do punch my holes, it might not be in the groove line, and that looks totally terrible. So I just kind of save myself the headache if there is a slight margin of error. And from a functionality standpoint, ideally there would be a groove line on the back, so I still have yet to figure out the way to do that. but I'm going to be doing some experimenting this week because I'm creating my own line of axe sheaths that are pre-made. So I'm going to try and make the best possible axe sheath that you can buy right off the shelf, and it's going to have like the most premium features on my premium line. I'm also going to have a utility line, which is a bit more basic, but it's going to be good for your user axes that you don't need a beautiful, absolutely perfect sheath for. I'm going to make more videos about that little business idea in the future, and I'll make some buying guides and all that kind of stuff. But what you just saw was me marking my holes with stitching chisels, then using a drill press to drill all the way through. That sets the distance from each hole. And then I use the stitching chisels again over the drill press hole, and that makes the hole look a lot nicer. Also, I recommend using a drill that's the same size as your needle or a bit smaller, and that protects the stitches from dust and debris, and it also just looks nicer. And now I'm figuring out where my other hole has to go for my snap, and what you do is you just put your snap into your first flap hole, and then you fold it over like you normally would, and that just figures out the spacing that you need to do. And as you can see, I tried it like 3 times, so I'm not going to make it too tight or too loose, and all of those marks are just about in the same spot, so that means it's going to be pretty nice. And when I punch this hole, I make sure to have something on the inside of the sheath, because we're only trying to put a hole on one side. We don't want to go through the backside too. And now I can do a little test fit, and it looks very nice. One thing that I forgot to mention, that when you line up the holes, you want to have the axe inside of it so you're counting for the width of the axe. And now that I'm done that, I'm just going to dye the sheath one more time. This is so that I can get the edges and the little groove lines that I made. And now that I'm done dyeing, I'm going to let it dry for a little bit. Honestly, I don't let my dye dry for that long, just because I'm trying to make these at a reasonable speed. And I'm going to burnish after I dyed with gum tragacanth. I don't know if I pronounced that right, but it's a burnishing agent that kind of slicks the edges and gives them a mirror finish, and then also kind of like hardens onto the leather and keeps the fibers from separating. And I'm just going to do that for the entire sheath. I have this little wood slicker that I use, and you only want to apply a little bit of pressure. You don't want to apply as much as you possibly can, because we're not trying to mash the leather down. We're just trying to slick it, you know? And I think my edges look pretty nice. If I were to make something really small and fragile like a watch strap or a wallet, then I'd put a little bit more time into it. And now I'm using leather balm for the top coat. This is basically the last finish, and I think this applies a beautiful glossy finish on the leather. It looks way nicer than a normal oil like neat's foot oil. I personally use a cotton dauber to apply it, and then I buff it with a rag afterwards. Before, I was using a neat's foot oil soaked rag, which doesn't really let it dry very nicely, so I would recommend using a drier rag. And after that, it also helps kind of blend the leather dye together to make it look a bit more even. And it also apparently like helps the dye from seeping out, and I didn't know about that before, but that's a really nice benefit, because the dye that I use, at least, it is prone to seeping out, so like I wouldn't use it on a belt or something like that. Now we are reaching the very final stages. I'm going to punch my holes over again one more time with my stitching chisel. You actually don't have to do the middle step where I punch it after drilling. You can go straight from drilling to dyeing, and it's going to be the same result. So I filmed this video a few weeks ago, and since then I've kind of changed my process so I can be a bit faster. And right now I'm just stitching it. I'm doing a normal saddle stitch with my stitching pony, and sometimes when the needle gets stuck, I can use pliers to pull at it. And I'm not going to do a full saddle stitching tutorial, but I will say that it's way stronger than a stitching machine, because you can use waxed thread. And also, instead of piercing through the leather and looping it over, I'm going in from both directions. So that means if the thread were to back out, you can't just pull down the entire stitching line. You would actually have to like pull the thread out from each side of the hole, and it really just wouldn't come loose. Like, that's not possible. So at the end of this, I also backstitch twice, and that's another reason why it won't come out. Another thing I do is once I snip my thread, I burn it, and that mushrooms the thread out a little bit over the hole, and if I burn it long enough, then it kind of sticks to the thread of the stitching line, so it's kind of like all fused together. And I know some people make the argument of using rivets on your axe sheath because it protects the stress points, but with this style of sheath there's not really any stress points on it. Like, there's no pressure and the welt just isn't like going under any force. If you were to drop the axe, then it's possible it could eventually over time start to cut through that welt, where if you had rivets in the welt then it would stop the axe from going through. But that's just really unlikely unless if you're really abusing your axe. And I know some people do that, so a part of my utility line I am considering adding rivets, like maybe one on the top and one on the bottom, but it really just depends on the aesthetics and what I think would fit the best. Now I am peening over the top part of the snap onto the cap, and that locks it into place. It's kind of like a rivet in the sense that it's folding over onto itself, and if you do this the right way, then the cap will kind of compress and sit into the leather. So that's really something that I aim for, because then that means that it won't get loose and then spin around. It couldn't really like fall off, but spinning around is a little bit annoying sometimes. Now I'm setting the other snap, and I use a tiny little mini anvil on the inside of the sheath because hammering onto the backside of the leather isn't a very sturdy surface. And this is what the final product looks like. I'm very happy with how this sheath turned out. It's very tight, especially since this axe is very tapered. And I made a little matching hatchet sheath to this one too that turned out very nicely. And I hope you guys liked this video. If you did, please feel free to like and subscribe, and peace out.